Hi, my name is David Martin and I'm joined today by my co-host Craig Patterson. This is the Heads and Horizons podcast, where we and our guests discuss the challenges of leadership and how, with a little professional help and support, leaders can better navigate change, deal with organisational complexity and create a more productive and engaging work environment leading to higher team performance.
Welcome, or maybe even welcome back to Heads and Horizons, a podcast series for leaders looking to navigate change and deliver meaningful outcomes for themselves and their teams. My name is Dave Martin, a leadership coach who's spent over 3 decades in sales and sales leadership roles in the tech sector, and I'm joined by my co-host, Craig Patterson, himself an executive coach and former Chief People and Technology Officer. So Craig, hi, tell me, what have you been up to since we last spoke? And actually, more importantly, how are those tomatoes that we've been discussing for the last couple of episodes?
Hi, Dave. I knew you'd have to get that one in. What have I been up to? Well, I've been enjoying some of the nice weather we've been having at the moment here, getting out on my bike, which has been really cool. And on the tomatoes, well, safe to say that I'm pleased you can still buy them in supermarkets. But the strangest things happened where I actually thought I bought 3 varieties of tomato. But for some reason, I seem to only have one type of tomato growing all 3 plants, which is quite interesting in itself. Trying to work out whether that's just a mislabeling or somehow some genetic modification. But yeah, I'm certainly it's not a feast. It's not quite a famine, but maybe more of an update on our final podcast of this series next time.
Well, I look forward to it. There's a tomatoes and tomatoes gag there somewhere, but we'll leave that for the next episode, because this is what episode 4, I believe, of this series. And today we're discussing the conversations that leaders avoid and how best to tackle those really tough discussions with integrity. So, first question for you then, Craig, if that's okay, which is when do even seasoned leaders avoid tough conversations, and what's the hidden cost of that avoidance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this, Dave, through your career as well. But, it doesn't really matter how senior you get. It's still not a given that people are prepared to have confrontation. And sometimes in these situations, tough conversations, they can feel like confrontation. You obviously want to try to make sure that that is done in a way that doesn't immediately come across like that. But that can be a reason for procrastinating. With a lot of leaders, that they have fear of damaging relationships. They're worried, especially if they're senior people or high value. So, for example, if perhaps you've got an M&A deal and you've acquired a leader from a previous business, they may have high value from a customer and a retention perspective, but you may have a tough message that you need to give them. It might just be that it's considered not the right time. Maybe it's, look, I need to give them a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit more time to adjust to the culture. There's all these sort of things come in. There can also be a concern about triggering emotion. And that goes back to my point about confrontation. People don't feel comfortable with that. If you get a situation where people are maybe angry or they're defensive, or even worse, that there's tears involved. Quite often leaders will prioritise short-term harmony over long-term clarity. So it's better that people get along in the short term and we'll sort of push the can down the road, because maybe it will just sort itself out. Or somebody else in the team will have a word, because they'll be recognised, or they'll recognise there's something at play here. Many, of course, have never had the training to actually deal with tough conversations well. That's another thing that's in the way, because not all companies or all leaders have gone through training and development or seen what good looks like in this case. What are the hidden costs? Well, I think trust erosion. I think that's amongst the team members who feel there's something that's not been said, that it should have been said. There can be this sort of cultural, almost a drift in the culture to where we're trying to go. So if we're saying that we're a really action-oriented team, and yet there's a member of that team who's clearly not on the same page, well, what does that mean? Or we say that there's the culture, we stand for these values, but somebody's not delivering those. Well, what does that mean? So that's the cultural drift. I think there can be a loss of performance because clearly, if somebody's going off in a different direction or something's not being addressed, it can compound and it can become even bigger. You also could risk reputational damage through not dealing with something. So again, somebody may be, for example, talking to external suppliers or customers in a way that's not aligned with the strategic direction of the business. I think the key thing I would say is that avoidance, is rarely invisible and it's never neutral. So there's consequences, is what I'm really saying around avoidance. And people do see it, even if you think they haven't. That would be my take, Dave. I don't know whether you've got anything to add.
It's interesting you mentioned consequences at the end there, Craig, because that's so true. I think there is a natural inclination to convince ourselves that now is not the right time. We can do this tomorrow. That we can see how things pan out. But as you say, those decisions come with consequences down the line. Interesting. I was reading a book by Leanne Davey. The title of it slips my mind right now, but that's really around how organizations, the best organizations or the best teams, actually thrive on productive conflict and actually need it. But as you say, it's never personal. That would be my assessment.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting chat.
Great. So look, a question to you, Dave, then. What are the most common conversations leaders dodge, in your view? And what's underneath the hesitation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess the conversations around conflict, like as we've been discussing, springs to mind. But I'd say delivering bad news. Yeah, delivering bad news is probably, in my opinion, the most common conversation that leaders seek to avoid. Whether it's a poor personal performance review, a negative structural change impacting the team or an individual's role, dire quarterly sales numbers maybe, and I've had to do that a few times myself over the years. Or simply telling a valued team member that the promotion they thought was in the bag is actually on hold. But the reality is that's just business at the end of the day. It's not personal, as we were saying, and difficult conversations are just part of the gig, right? That's what we signed up for. But there are also obviously cultural elements as to why not everyone can see it that way. Working in international teams for many years, I was often humorously reminded of the very British traits of understatement and indirectness. But it's not just us Brits who struggle. Many leaders from whatever cultural background still fall into the trap of excessively empathizing. They empathize so strongly with the recipient of the bad news that they themselves over-identify with their potential discomfort, choosing avoidance, as we were discussing before, choosing avoidance to spare them pain. Now, there's a lot of potential other reasons too, but I think just one more common one is simply, as you highlighted, simply a lack of confidence or a skill deficit. Even experienced leaders can feel underprepared or ill-equipped to handle sensitive topics effectively, and might actually doubt their ability to communicate clearly, manage those emotions, theirs and others, or navigate the complexities of a high-stakes conversation. So, in summary, I'd say that avoidance is often less about weakness and more about complex psychological trade-offs. Balancing empathy, self-image, perceived competence, and social dynamics. That would be my quick assessment, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think all that resonates, Dave. So thank you.
Okay, well, so look, moving on, as always, one eye on the clock, Craig. So the next question for you. What helps leaders move from avoidance to action without damaging trust or authority?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a great question. So I think it's start with the intent. What are you trying to get from this conversation, this tough conversation, as opposed to getting straight into the content? So what is the purpose, framing the purpose of the conversation? And make sure that what you want to say, if you've got the opportunity to prepare. So what is your messaging? Take care in thinking about what that is, thinking about how clear you can be in terms of what you're trying to get across. Because again, as we've said, sometimes there can be this feeling that you should empathize. And it almost is like, well, hang on, I don't know whether you remember something called the praise sandwich, but it was like, you deliver the good, then you hide the bad, and then you finish with the good. And people left the room thinking, actually that was all right. And I'm not really sure exactly what was the issue. But the leader somehow sits back and feels, actually, that went quite well. But everybody just left the room not really sure and didn't address the real elephant in the room, which is that bit in the middle. So I think a bit of preparation, but being clear and anchoring the message in care, but also clarity is really important. Name the discomfort. So I think if there's, for example, if somebody's doing something that is not feeling great, then I think naming it can be a good thing. I think framing the conversation around the fact, look, this is not an easy discussion, but it's something that is important that we have to address, can be good, because I think it then plants the seed in people's minds that there's something coming. Some simple frameworks. There's two I've got here, which is one is situation, behaviour, impact. The other is belief, impact, request. So what we mean by that is, in the first one, it's what's the situation that's difficult, that's causing this difficult, tough conversation? What behaviours are you seeing around that? And what impact is that therefore having? It's a great way to frame the conversation with the recipient. Similarly, belief, impact, request, similar again in terms of, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I believe I'm seeing, this is the impact that it's having, and this is what I'd like to see you do differently. I think that's very clear then about people leave the room knowing there's been a conversation, but hopefully, as you said, not personal, not defensive, just really factual. Now, of course, you can't predict how these conversations are going to go, but I think having that sort of mindset about being clear, giving the clarity, having maybe a framework if that helps, I think would aid for that conversation to be hopefully more productive than not. The other thing is, don't go into blame. So focus on shared outcomes. So what's in it for them, and what's in it for you, and what's in it for the organisation, the people in the organisation. And try not to get into conflict. So if things do boil up and it becomes very difficult, then I think the key thing is to take time out. It's always okay to say, look, clearly this is an emotive conversation. I think it would be useful if we took a pause there and we'll come back to the conversation rather than just letting it boil over into some sort of unfiltered argument, which wouldn't be great. So there's some of the things that I would recommend that leaders think about to move from that avoidance to action.
Interesting points, and I just made a quick note of you mentioned blame. I think if it gets into blame, you've lost the argument, you've lost the room, and it's actually Cartman's drama triangle springs to mind. If you've fallen into one of those three personas, then something's gone badly wrong in the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. So Dave, back over to you then. Could you share an example where a leader has maybe faced a tough conversation, and what changed because of coaching that you've perhaps been able to give that person?
More an observation than necessarily coaching, Craig. And I will keep this brief, as I want to give you the opportunity to chime in as well if we can. So, look, I've worked for one or two really great leaders throughout my career, the ones who could seamlessly blend really challenging visions and goals with personal empathy and even kindness. They were the ones, and I'm speaking very metaphorically here, of course, who would willingly and without question follow over the top of the trench when the whistles blew. But they were also comfortable having the most difficult conversations, both upwards and downwards in an organisation. And so to highlight the point, those were the leaders who were not afraid to pull people up for underperformance, like let's say, but they were also more than willing to put themselves in the firing line as a buffer between a solid team member just going through some sort of temporary blip and senior management, taking the flak on behalf of an otherwise solid team player struggling just temporarily. And what changed as a consequence? Well, that sort of leadership breeds loyalty. And that kind of loyalty, if I'm being honest about it, I only ever felt towards one or two people that I personally worked for over my own career. But I was always more than willing to go above and beyond for those people in return. That would be sort of my own personal experience of leaders and the consequences of what they did for me. But if there's time, Craig, would be interested in your perspective as well.
Mm. Well, I think that I mean, I was just as you were talking, thinking about a situation I had back quite early on in my career when I had a team of about 6 people work for me. And I remember, I've always believed in being fairly direct and not beating around the bush. So, but also taking account of where you can people's feelings and trying to couch that with a bit of empathy, but not over the top to the point people don't know the messaging. But I always remember there was a bit of a complaint went around that these 6 people, everyone thought that for some reason they thought they were my favourite, which I found quite bizarre, really. But it transpired that everybody thought that the other person was my favourite, which I really found quite strange. And I suppose what I took from that was that, look, consistency is really important. You can't have favourites. You can't really, to be credible, I don't think you can allow some people to get away with things that others wouldn't. And I think that's important from just your values as a leader to say, treat everyone the same, but treat people how you like to be treated. Because that sort of spurious conversation about, oh, well, you've got a favourite. Actually, they were all wrong because I didn't. And they couldn't actually identify who it was. They all thought it was someone different. So I took something from that in terms of my leadership style. And I think being upfront and honest, and would people listening to this that have been managed by me perhaps disagree? They may do, but I think most people would recognise that timing may have been the only difference in terms of the delivery, not the avoidance. So, you sometimes have to look at a situation and say, I'll let that run a little bit longer, see how it plays out, but certainly not avoidance. It would come around if I didn't see the sort of level of delivery that I was looking for.
Interesting. Thank you.
So, look, thanks everybody for listening. We both hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Next time, we'll be back for episode 5, which is about renewal, transition, and what's next. That's the final episode in this first series of Heads and Horizons. And we'll explore how leaders navigate reinvention, scale down or pivot, and what it really takes to lead through transition. After that, we're going to take a short break before returning in the autumn with a new set of podcast episodes where we will discuss strategies and sharp-edged coaching insights. But in the meantime, thanks for listening. And as always, we would love to hear your feedback. Thanks very much.